Richard Sullivan was not a man who often heard the word no. At 42, with a net worth that made headlines and a portfolio that spanned 3 continents, he had grown accustomed to the world bending to his wishes. That evening, as the sunset painted the windows of the Oak Haven Country Club in shades of gold and amber, Richard swirled his 20-year-old scotch and surveyed his kingdom. Another boring charity season, sighed Thomas, Richard's oldest friend and business partner, as he loosened his bow tie. Same faces, same causes, same speeches. The exclusive club's private room housed only 6 men that night, each worth more than the combined annual incomes of the entire waitstaff serving them. They had just escaped from the spring charity gala downstairs, an event that Richard attended more for appearances than philanthropy. "I don't know," said Peter, looking through the glass doors at the crowd below. "There are some interesting additions this year." Richard followed Peter's gaze to a woman moving confidently through the ballroom, directing waiters and checking details on a tablet. She was dressed in a deep blue pantsuit that hugged her full figure, her dark hair swept up in an elegant twist that revealed dangling silver earrings. Unlike the other staff, who seemed to scurry like mice along the walls, she commanded the space, her plus-size frame moving with purpose and grace. "That's the new event coordinator," Thomas explained, noticing Richard's attention. "Olivia Parker. The board hired her company last month. Apparently she's some kind of miracle worker with these stuffy functions." Richard watched as Olivia gently redirected an elderly donor who had gotten lost looking for the restrooms, her smile warm and genuine even after what must have been hours on her feet. "She certainly doesn't fit the usual profile of the women around here," Richard commented, draining his glass. "What, you mean because she's fat?" laughed Derek, the youngest of their group, and in Richard's opinion the most obnoxious. "I'm surprised the board let her through the door. Isn't there some kind of weight restriction in the bylaws?" He snickered at his own joke. Richard felt a flicker of discomfort but pushed it aside. This was how they always talked, sharp, sometimes cruel, never serious. "She's actually quite good at her job," said Thomas, surprising Richard with his defense. "My wife said last month's hospital fundraiser raised 30% more than last year under her management." "Still," Derek persisted, his 4th whiskey making him louder than necessary, "not exactly the type you'd bring home to mother, is she, Richard?" The men turned to Richard expectantly. He was, after all, the group's most notorious bachelor, having dated models, actresses, and even a minor European royal over the years. His romantic exploits often provided entertainment for these gatherings. Richard shrugged. "Not my type." "Of course not," Derek laughed. "Your type requires at least 6 hours of daily gym time and a diet of air and water." "I have standards," Richard replied coolly, though something about the conversation was making him uneasy. Maybe it was the way Olivia had helped an older woman find her seat, showing genuine kindness that seemed rare in these circles. "Standards?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it now? When was your last relationship that lasted longer than a weekend yacht trip?" The other men laughed, and Richard felt his pride sting. It was true that his relationships were typically brief and superficial, but he preferred to think of himself as selective rather than commitment-phobic. "I could commit if I wanted to," he said defensively. "I just haven't found someone worth the effort." "Or maybe," said Victor, who had been quietly observing until now, "you just don't have it in you. Some men aren't built for real relationships. They just play at them." A heavy silence fell over the group. Victor, the only happily married man among them, had struck a nerve. "That's ridiculous," Richard said, gesturing to the waiter for another drink. "I could marry anyone I wanted. It's a choice to remain single." "Anyone?" Derek challenged, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Even her?" He nodded toward Olivia, who was now adjusting a floral arrangement near the stage. "That's not—" Richard began, but Derek cut him off. "I don't think you could do it," he said. "I don't think you could last 6 months married to a woman like that. Your shallow little heart would give out." Richard felt 5 pairs of eyes on him waiting. He knew he should laugh it off, change the subject, act like the mature businessman he presented to the world. Instead, something hot and defiant rose in his chest. "How much?" he asked quietly. Thomas blinked. "How much what?" "How much would you bet that I couldn't do it?" Richard clarified, his voice level but his heart racing with the recklessness of what he was suggesting. The men exchanged glances, a mixture of shock and growing excitement on their faces. "Are you serious?" Peter asked. You would marry that woman for a bet? Richard shrugged, feigning casualness he didn't feel. Why not? Marriage is just a contract. People enter into those every day. $1 million, Derek said suddenly. Each of us puts in $1 million. If you stay married to her for 6 months, you get $5 million. If you back out or she leaves you, you pay us each $1 million. That's insane, Thomas muttered. But his eyes were bright with interest. It's disgusting is what it is, Victor said, standing up. I'm not participating in this. But he made no move to leave the room. Richard knew he should stop this now. He was not this person, or at least he didn't want to be. Yet the challenge had been issued, his pride wounded, and backing down wasn't in his nature. Fine, he said, but 8 months, not 6, and no interference from any of you. How would you even do it? Peter asked. You can't just walk up to a woman and propose. Richard smiled, the same smile that closed billion-dollar deals and charmed the most resistant of business partners. Leave that to me. As if on cue, Olivia entered their private room, tablet in hand. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to check if you'll be rejoining the main event for the donation announcements in 20 minutes. 5 men turned to look at Richard, their expressions ranging from disbelief to barely contained laughter. Richard stood, straightening his custom tuxedo, and approached Olivia with a smile that had opened doors around the world. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you privately for a moment, he said smoothly. I have a proposal regarding a personal project. Olivia looked at him with clear, intelligent eyes that showed neither intimidation nor the fluttering interest Richard usually inspired in women. I'm quite busy with the gala right now, Mr. Sullivan. Perhaps you could email my office tomorrow? Richard wasn't used to being dismissed, especially by staff. It would only take a few minutes of your time, and it could be quite beneficial for your business. Behind him, he heard Derek's poorly suppressed snicker. Olivia checked her watch, then nodded briskly. 5 minutes, then. We can use the small conference room across the hall. As Richard followed her out, he heard the murmurs and laughter from his friends. The recklessness of what he was doing began to sink in, but his pride wouldn't let him turn back. What Richard didn't see was Olivia's brief pause by the door, the way she glanced back at the group of wealthy men watching her leave with Richard, or the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she had caught more of their conversation than they realized. In the empty conference room, with its polished table and views of the golf course now cloaked in early evening shadows, Richard found himself oddly nervous. Olivia stood with her back straight, waiting expectantly. Your work tonight has been impressive, he began, falling back on business talk to steady himself. The gala is running smoothly. Thank you, she replied, her tone professional. But I doubt you brought me here to compliment my event management skills. Mr. Sullivan? Richard studied her face, the clear brown eyes that met his without flinching, the full lips set in a patient but slightly wary expression, the smooth skin that needed no makeup to glow in the room's soft lighting. She was beautiful, he realized with surprise. Not in the conventional way he had programmed himself to recognize, but undeniably, naturally beautiful. For a brief moment, he considered abandoning the bet. But then he remembered the laughter, the challenge, the doubt in Victor's voice when he questioned Richard's capacity for commitment. Pride won out. I have a proposition for you, Ms. Parker, he said, his voice dropping to the intimate tone that had closed his most important deals, one that might sound unusual at first but could solve problems for both of us. What Richard didn't know, as he prepared to make the most outrageous offer of his life, was that this bet would become the wager that changed everything. Not just for Olivia, but for himself in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Olivia didn't immediately respond to Richard's proposition. Instead, she placed her tablet on the conference table, folded her hands, and studied him with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people for a living. Let me get this straight, she finally said, her voice remarkably steady. You want to marry me for 8 months as part of a bet with your friends, and in return, you'll pay off my mother's medical bills and provide startup funding for my own event planning company. Richard shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. He hadn't expected her to be so calm. He'd anticipated shock, outrage, maybe even the threat of a lawsuit, reactions he could navigate with his usual charm and checkbook. This measured response threw him off balance. When you put it that way, it sounds worse than I intended, he admitted. But essentially, yes, it would be a business arrangement, nothing more. We'd have separate bedrooms, separate lives. You'd just need to attend some social functions with me, play the part in public. And why me? Olivia asked, her eyebrow raised slightly. There must be dozens of women in your social circle who would jump at the chance to be Mrs. Sullivan, even temporarily. Richard hesitated. He couldn't very well tell her that her size was the central point of the bet, that his friends didn't believe he could stomach being married to a fat woman for 8 months. Even in his morally compromised state, he recognized how cruel that would sound. You're not part of my world, he said instead. You're not after my money or connections. You're professional, discreet, and from what I've seen tonight, extremely competent. It makes the arrangement cleaner. Olivia smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. I see. And it has nothing to do with the conversation I overheard while waiting outside your private room earlier. The one where your friend Derek suggested you couldn't last 6 months married to, what was the phrase? A woman like that? Richard felt the blood drain from his face. You heard that. I did, she confirmed, standing up and smoothing her blue pantsuit. I hear a lot of things in my line of work, Mr. Sullivan. People tend to forget the staff have ears. Richard braced himself for the slap, the drink in his face, the storm out that he deserved. Instead, Olivia picked up her tablet and checked something on the screen. The main donations are being announced in 10 minutes. I need to be downstairs, she said matter-of-factly. But I'm not saying no. Richard blinked, certain he had misheard. You're not? My mother's cancer treatments cost nearly $300,000. The debt is crushing me, and it's preventing me from building my business beyond small local events like this, she explained, her voice softer now, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability. I'd do a lot more than pretend to be someone's wife for 8 months to give her the retirement she deserves after raising me alone. Richard felt a strange mixture of relief and shame wash over him. So you'll do it? I didn't say that either, Olivia replied, her professional demeanor returning. I need time to think, and if I agree I'll have conditions of my own. This wouldn't be you buying me, Mr. Sullivan. It would be a partnership with mutual benefits and defined boundaries. She walked to the door, then turned back. I'll meet you tomorrow at 1 p.m. at Riverside Coffee on Front Street. It's quieter there, away from your social circle. I'll give you my answer then. With that, she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Richard stood alone in the conference room, feeling oddly like he'd entered negotiations expecting the upper hand, only to find himself outmaneuvered before they'd even begun. Riverside Coffee was nothing like the upscale establishments Richard typically frequented. The mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and staff who greeted customers by name created an atmosphere so different from the sterile luxury of his usual haunts that he felt conspicuous in his tailored suit. Olivia was already there when he arrived, dressed in dark jeans and a flowing teal blouse that complemented her olive skin. Her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, making her look younger and more relaxed than she had at the gala. She was writing in a leather-bound notebook, a half-eaten muffin and large tea on the table before her. You're late, she said without looking up as he approached. Richard checked his watch. It's exactly 1 o'clock. No, it's 1:03, she corrected, finally meeting his eyes. Small detail, but in my business 3 minutes can be the difference between a perfect event and a disaster. She closed her notebook and gestured to the empty chair across from her. Please sit. Richard did, feeling strangely like he was the one being interviewed. A server approached and he ordered a black coffee. Have you thought about my proposal? He asked once they were alone again. I have, Olivia said, pulling out a folder from her bag, and I've drafted what I consider fair terms for our arrangement, should I agree to it. She slid the folder across the table. Richard opened it to find a neatly typed document that looked remarkably like the business contracts he dealt with daily. 1 year, not 8 months, she began, tapping the first point on the page. If I'm going to upend my life for this, I want the security of a full year's financial support. Richard frowned. That's longer than the bet requires. The bet is your problem, not mine, Olivia said simply. I'm negotiating for what I need. Richard scanned the other terms, separate living arrangements but within the same residence, a substantial monthly allowance, payment of her mother's medical bills within the first month, seed money for her business placed in escrow to be released upon completion of the year, and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent either of them from revealing the true nature of their arrangement. You've thought this through, he admitted, impressed despite himself. Unlike you, she replied with a small smile that took the sting out of her words. This isn't a game for me, Richard. This is my life, my reputation, my future. If I do this, it will change everything. How clients see me, how my friends treat me, how my mother feels about my choices. For the first time, Richard felt the full weight of what he was asking. This woman would be sacrificing her privacy, opening herself to scrutiny and gossip, all because he couldn't walk away from a childish dare. Why would you even consider it? He asked quietly. After what you overheard? Olivia took a sip of her tea before answering. My mother worked 2 jobs to raise me after my father left. When I was teased in school for being the fat girl, she taught me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. When I wanted to start my own business instead of going to college, she supported me even though it terrified her. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. Now she's sick and there's something I can do to help her. How could I not consider it? Richard felt something shift inside him, a small crack in the armor of privilege and detachment he'd built around himself. I admire that, he said honestly. Your loyalty to her. Don't admire it, Olivia said, her voice sharper now. Just respect it enough to take this arrangement seriously. If we do this, there are real consequences for both of us. The server returned with Richard's coffee, and they sat in silence until she left. I'll agree to your terms, Richard finally said, pushing the folder back toward her. 1 year, all conditions met. Olivia studied him, searching his face for something, sincerity perhaps, or decency. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it to continue. Then I have one last condition, she said, her voice softer now. If we're going to convince people this is real, there needs to be a story. How we met, why we fell for each other, why we're rushing into marriage. And that story can't be about you taking pity on the fat girl or being attracted to me despite my size. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I won't be anyone's charity case or fetish, even pretend. Richard felt a flush of shame at how close her words hit to his initial thinking. What do you suggest? We tell people we connected at the gala, that you were drawn to my confidence and I to your... Well, I'm sure I'll think of something, she said with a hint of teasing in her voice. We say we've been quietly dating for the past month and realized life is too short to waste time when you find the right person. A whirlwind romance, Richard nodded. People will be surprised, but they'll believe I'm impulsive enough for it. And we need to make it convincing, Olivia continued. Which means you need to look at me, really look at me, and decide if you can touch my hand in public without flinching. If you can introduce me to your business associates without embarrassment. If you can stand next to me in photos that will be in the society pages. Richard met her gaze, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. The intelligence in her brown eyes, the fullness of her face, the confident set of her shoulders. She was asking if he could pretend to love her body. The very thing his friends had bet he would find repulsive. I can do that, he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Olivia held out her hand across the table. Then, Mr. Sullivan, it seems we have an arrangement. As Richard took her hand to seal their deal, neither of them noticed the photographer from the society pages who happened to be having lunch at a corner table, nor the quick snap of his camera, capturing what appeared to be an intimate moment between the city's most eligible bachelor and a woman no one had ever seen him with before. The photo of Richard and Olivia holding hands at Riverside Coffee hit the society pages the very next day. By evening, Richard's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from friends and business associates, all variations of the same question. Who is she? 2 weeks later, Richard stood in the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel, watching Olivia charm a group of his most important clients. She wore a deep burgundy dress that hugged her curves, her hair swept up to reveal a neck adorned with the diamond pendant he had given her as part of their public courtship. The wedding was set for next Saturday, a small, intimate ceremony that had somehow become the most talked-about event of the season. I have to hand it to you, Thomas said, appearing at Richard's side with 2 glasses of champagne. When you commit to something, you really commit. Richard accepted the champagne, his eyes still on Olivia. She's making it easy, he said, surprising himself with how true the words felt. The guys think you've lost your mind, Thomas continued, his voice lowered. Derek's already shopping for a new sports car with his anticipated winnings. Richard felt a flicker of irritation. It's been 2 weeks. He might want to hold off on that purchase. So you're really going through with the wedding, not just the engagement? Of course, Richard replied, watching as Olivia laughed at something his client's wife said. Her laugh was genuine, full-bodied and unrestrained, not the practiced titter of the women he usually dated. That was the bet, wasn't it? 8 months of marriage. It was, Thomas confirmed, studying Richard carefully. But none of us actually thought you'd make it to the altar. Before Richard could respond, Olivia caught his eye across the room and gestured subtly for him to join her. He excused himself from Thomas and made his way to her side, slipping his arm around her waist with practiced ease. Mr. Chen was just telling me about his expansion plans in Singapore, Olivia said smoothly. I mentioned your recent acquisition there might be of interest. Richard blinked in surprise. He'd mentioned the Singapore deal exactly once during a phone call Olivia had overheard, while they were discussing wedding details. The fact that she'd not only remembered it but made the connection to Chen's business was impressive. Yes, absolutely, Richard recovered quickly, launching into business talk while keeping his arm around Olivia. This was the third time she'd made a connection that might benefit his company. For someone supposedly just playing a part, she was proving remarkably invested in making their partnership work on all levels. Later that night, as Richard's driver took them back to his penthouse, now their shared home, though Olivia maintained a separate bedroom as agreed, she kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. You were brilliant tonight, Richard said, loosening his tie. Chen's wife normally hates everyone, but she gave you her private number. Olivia smiled tiredly. Women like Lily Chen are used to being invisible once business talk starts. I just made sure she wasn't. Well, it worked. Chen texted me before we left that he wants to move forward with the partnership. Olivia nodded but seemed distracted. She'd been quieter than usual all evening. Is everything okay? Richard asked, surprising himself with his concern. Olivia hesitated, then reached for her purse and pulled out her phone. My mother's doctors called today. The latest treatment isn't working as well as they hoped. Richard felt a sudden tightness in his chest. In their 3 weeks of acquaintance, Olivia rarely spoke about her mother's illness, though he knew from their agreement that cancer treatments were the primary reason she'd accepted his proposal. I'm sorry, he said, wishing he had better words. Is there anything I can do? You're already doing it, she replied, her voice soft but matter-of-fact. The bills are being paid. She has a private room now, with a view of the garden. The nurses know her by name. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Do you know what a difference that makes? To be treated like a person, not just another patient? Richard didn't know, not really. He'd never had to worry about receiving less than the best care, the most personal attention. The reminder of his privilege made him uncomfortable, but it also made him want to ensure Olivia and her mother never had to worry about such things again. I could visit her with you sometime, he offered impulsively. If that would help. Olivia's expression softened. That's kind, but unnecessary. This arrangement doesn't need to extend to my personal life any more than it already has. Her words stung more than Richard expected. Right, he said, his tone cooling. Just business. Olivia studied him for a moment, then sighed. I didn't mean it like that. It's just, my mother is the most important person in my life. She's also the only one who knows the truth about our arrangement. I don't want to confuse things. Confuse what things? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Olivia gestured vaguely between them. This, us, the lines are already blurring, aren't they? You're not just my fake fiancé at parties anymore. You're the man who remembers how I take my coffee, who bought me reading glasses when I forgot mine, who actually listens when I talk about my business plans. Richard hadn't realized he'd done those things, or rather hadn't realized they might mean something. They had just seemed like the natural actions of someone sharing space with another person. Is that a problem? He asked carefully. It might be, Olivia admitted, for both of us. The car pulled up to Richard's building, ending their conversation as the driver opened the door. As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse in silence, Richard found himself thinking about how quickly Olivia had become a fixture in his life. His housekeeper now stocked the kitchen with the tea Olivia preferred. His previously minimalist living room now had colorful throw pillows and actual books on the shelves. His calendar, once filled only with business meetings and obligatory social appearances, now included things like cake tasting and Olivia's event at the museum. Inside the penthouse, Olivia headed toward her room but paused at the hallway. Richard? He turned to her, struck by how natural it felt to see her there in his home saying his name. Thank you, she said simply, for asking about my mother, for caring. Even if it's just part of the act, it's nice." Before he could respond, she disappeared into her room, leaving Richard with the uncomfortable realization that he wasn't sure anymore what was an act and what wasn't. The wedding was small by Richard's standards, but still lavish by most people's. Only 60 guests gathered in the garden of his Hamptons estate, where white roses and silver ribbons transformed the already beautiful space into something magical. Richard had left most of the planning to Olivia, whose event coordination skills proved invaluable, and even he had to admit the results were stunning. "You're actually going through with it," Derek said, adjusting Richard's tie in the guest house that served as the groom's quarters. "I have to say, I'm impressed by your commitment to winning." Richard's jaw tightened. "Is that what you think this is about? The bet?" Derek laughed. "What else would it be about?" "Come on, Richard. She's not exactly your usual type." "And what is my usual type?" Richard asked, his voice deceptively calm. "You know," Derek shrugged. "Tall, thin, preferably blonde, decorative. The kind of woman other men envy you for." Richard thought about Olivia. Her quick mind, her kind heart, her ability to put people at ease or command a room as needed. In the past month, she'd helped him close 2 deals that had been stalled for years, simply by noticing details about his business partners that he'd missed. She'd also made his empty penthouse feel like a home for the first time since he'd bought it. "Maybe my usual type was wrong for me," he said quietly. Derek's eyes widened. "Wait, you're not actually falling for her, are you?" "That would be time to go," Thomas interrupted, poking his head into the room. Everyone seated. Richard straightened his shoulders and walked out without answering Derek's question, partly because he wasn't sure of the answer himself. The ceremony passed in a blur. Richard spoke his vows mechanically, aware of the cameras capturing every moment, of his friends watching with varying degrees of amusement and disbelief, of Olivia's mother in the front row, thin from her treatments but beaming with pride. It wasn't until the moment came for him to kiss his bride that time seemed to slow down. Olivia looked up at him, her eyes questioning. They had practiced this, agreed it would be brief and chaste, just enough to be convincing, but as Richard leaned down, his hands gently cupping her face, something shifted. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but when Olivia's hand came up to rest against his chest, Richard felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the summer heat or the champagne he'd had earlier. Without thinking, he deepened the kiss, one hand sliding to the small of her back to draw her closer. When they finally pulled apart, the applause of their guests seemed distant compared to the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. Olivia's cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide with surprise and something else he couldn't quite read. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan." As they turned to face their guests, Richard took Olivia's hand and squeezed it gently. She squeezed back, a gesture so small yet somehow more meaningful than the rings they had just exchanged. They moved down the aisle together, husband and wife in name if not in truth. Yet as the guests threw rose petals and called out congratulations, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something real had just happened, something neither of them had planned for. 3 months into their marriage, Richard sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, staring at an invitation he'd received that morning, the annual business gala at the Oak Haven Country Club. The very event where he'd first met Olivia and made that foolish bet was happening next weekend. "Your 3 o'clock is here," his assistant announced through the intercom, breaking his thoughts. Richard tucked the invitation into his desk drawer and straightened his tie. The meeting went well enough, but he found his mind wandering throughout. He couldn't stop thinking about how different his life had become since that night at the club. His penthouse, once a showplace featured in architectural magazines but never truly lived in, now felt like a home. The kitchen actually smelled like food because Olivia loved to cook. The living room had become a place where they often sat in companionable silence, Richard reviewing contracts while Olivia sketched event designs or tested recipes for the cookbook she'd begun writing. Most surprising of all was how much he enjoyed their public appearances together. Olivia had a gift for remembering personal details about people they met, their children's names, their hobbies, their food preferences, and used that information to make genuine connections. Clients who had been difficult for years now called Richard directly, asking for meetings where they brought that lovely wife of yours. The marriage that had started as a cruel bet had somehow become the most successful partnership of his life. And yet they still slept in separate bedrooms, still maintained the careful boundaries Olivia had established from the beginning. "You're distracted today," Thomas commented as they walked to lunch later that afternoon. "Trouble in paradise?" Richard shot him a sharp look. "Everything's fine. The guys are starting to talk, you know," Thomas continued, lowering his voice as they entered the restaurant. "It's been 3 months and you seem happy. Derek's convinced you're just a better actor than anyone gave you credit for." "Maybe I am happy," Richard replied, surprising himself with the admission. "Olivia is... she's not what I expected." Thomas studied him for a moment. "You know the bet was stupid, right? We were drunk and bored and behaving like college frat boys instead of grown men." Richard felt a wave of shame wash over him. "I know. Have you told her about it? The real terms, I mean." Richard shook his head. "She knows there was a bet involving our marriage, but not the specifics. Not that it was about her weight. You might want to come clean before someone else does," Thomas warned. "Derek's been drinking too much lately, running his mouth. It would be a shame if she heard it from him instead of you." The thought of Olivia learning the full truth filled Richard with dread. She'd be hurt, possibly angry enough to leave, and the realization that he didn't want her to leave scared him more than he cared to admit. That evening, Richard came home to find Olivia in the kitchen. Her hair pulled back in a messy bun as she stirred something that smelled amazing. She'd kicked off her shoes, and her reading glasses were perched on her nose as she consulted a handwritten recipe. "You're cooking," he observed, setting down his briefcase. Olivia looked up with a smile that made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Testing a new recipe for the book. My mother's beef stew with a few tweaks. Want to be my guinea pig?" "Always," he said, and meant it. In the past 3 months, he'd tasted more home-cooked meals than in the previous 10 years of his life. His personal chef, who used to prepare bland, protein-heavy meals that Richard ate without really tasting, had been given a long vacation. "How was your day?" Olivia asked, handing him a glass of red wine. "Good," he said automatically, then paused. "Actually, we need to talk about something." Olivia's expression grew serious. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just important." Richard took a deep breath. "The Oakhaven Gala is next weekend, where we met." "I remember," Olivia said carefully, turning down the heat under her pot. "Is there a problem with attending?" "No, it's just... I think it's time I told you the whole truth about that night." "About the bet." Olivia's face stilled. She removed her glasses and set them on the counter. "I'm listening." Richard struggled to find the right words. How could he tell this woman, whom he'd come to respect and admire, possibly even more, that their entire relationship had begun because his friends didn't think he could stomach being married to someone of her size? "The bet wasn't just about me getting married on a whim," he finally said, his voice low. "It was specifically about marrying you. Because you were... because of your size. Derek said I couldn't last 6 months married to a woman like you. That's why the others were laughing when I approached you." He couldn't meet her eyes as he continued. "Each of them put up $1 million. If I stay married to you for the full 8 months, I get $5 million. If not, I pay them each $1 million. The silence that followed felt endless. When Richard finally looked up, Olivia's face was unreadable. "Say something," he pleaded. "I already knew," she said quietly. Richard stared at her. "What?" "I heard more of your conversation that night than I let on," Olivia explained, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. "I heard Derek's exact words about a woman like that. I knew exactly what the bet was about." "Then why?" Richard couldn't finish the question. "Why did I agree?" Olivia picked up her wooden spoon and resumed stirring, though she no longer seemed focused on the food. "At first, it was just about the money. My mother's medical bills, the chance to start my own company without years of struggling. I thought I could compartmentalize, treat it like any other business transaction." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But then something happened that I didn't expect. You started to see me, really see me, not just as the fat woman you married on a bet, but as a person with thoughts and feelings and skills. Do you know how rare that is, to be truly seen?" Richard felt a lump forming in his throat. "Olivia, let me finish," she said gently. "These past 3 months I've watched you change. The man who made that bet would never have sat through my mother's chemo treatment with her, holding her hand and telling silly stories to distract her. He wouldn't have remembered that I love peonies and filled my room with them on my birthday. He wouldn't have actually read my cookbook proposal and offered thoughtful feedback. Richard remembered doing all those things, not because he was trying to win a bet or maintain their charade, but because they had felt right. Because they had made Olivia happy, and somewhere along the way her happiness had become important to him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling wholly inadequate for how this started, "for not telling you everything sooner." Olivia nodded, acknowledging his apology without quite accepting it. "The gala is next weekend. What do you want to do?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "Part of me wants to tell Derek and the others to keep their money, that the bet is off because this isn't a game anymore. But another part wants to see their faces when they realize I've not only lasted the full 8 months, but would happily stay married to you indefinitely." As soon as the words left his mouth, Richard realized what he'd said. Olivia's eyes widened and she set down her spoon with a clatter. "You would?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard moved around the kitchen island to stand before her. For the first time, he allowed himself to really look at her, not as the woman he'd married on a bet, not as his business partner in an elaborate charade, but as Olivia, the person who had somehow become essential to his happiness. "I would," he said softly. "These past months with you have been the most real my life has felt in years. Maybe ever." Olivia studied his face, searching for sincerity. "This wasn't part of our arrangement." "No," Richard agreed. "It wasn't. I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted. "How do I know this isn't just another version of the game? That you haven't convinced yourself you feel something just to win?" It was a fair question, one Richard had asked himself more than once in recent weeks. But standing here now, seeing the vulnerability beneath Olivia's usual confidence, he knew the answer with sudden clarity. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. "There's something I need to show you." He led her to his home office and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. From it, he withdrew a thick envelope and handed it to her. "What is this?" Olivia asked, opening it to find legal documents. "I had my lawyers draw it up last week," Richard explained. "It's a transfer of $5 million, the exact amount of the bet, to your mother's medical foundation. I've already signed it. All it needs is the date." Olivia looked up from the papers, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand. If I win the bet, the money goes directly to your mother's foundation. I never touch it." Richard took a deep breath. "Whatever happens between us, whether we stay together or part ways when our year is up, I don't want that money. I don't want anything that came from hurting you." Tears spilled onto Olivia's cheeks, and Richard gently wiped them away with his thumb. "I can't undo how we started," he said softly. "But I can choose how we continue. And I choose you, Olivia, not because of a bet or an arrangement, but because somehow you've become the most important person in my life." Olivia looked down at the documents in her hands, then back up at Richard. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear and something that felt remarkably like hope. "The stew," she said suddenly. "It's going to burn." They rushed back to the kitchen together, laughing as Olivia rescued her pot from the heat. As she stirred and tasted and adjusted seasonings, Richard watched her with a sense of wonder, realizing that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he wanted to be. The night of the Oak Haven Gala arrived with a steady autumn rain that painted the windows of their penthouse with shimmering streaks. Richard adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, remembering how a year ago he'd stood in a similar position, unaware that his life was about to change forever. "Zip me up?" Olivia's voice came from the doorway of their bedroom. Not his bedroom anymore, but theirs. The separate rooms agreement had quietly dissolved 3 weeks ago, after their conversation about the bet and what had grown between them. Richard turned to find Olivia in a midnight blue gown that made her brown eyes look almost black in the soft lighting. The dress hugged her curves without apology, adorned with subtle beading that caught the light when she moved. Her hair was swept up in an elegant style that revealed the diamond earrings he'd given her that morning. "Just because," he'd said, though they both knew it marked 8 months since their wedding day. "You look stunning," he said, meaning every word as he stepped behind her to zip the dress. "You don't think it's too much?" Olivia asked, smoothing the fabric over her hips. "It's more fitted than I usually wear." Richard placed his hands gently on her shoulders and met her eyes in the mirror. It's perfect. You're perfect. A soft blush colored Olivia's cheeks. This was still new for both of them. The genuine compliments, the casual touches, the sharing of space without the careful boundaries they'd maintained for so long. Are you ready for this? She asked, turning to face him. Seeing them all again? Knowing what they were betting on? Richard had been asking himself the same question all week. The last time he'd seen Derek and the others had been at their wedding. He'd gradually pulled away from that friend group, finding their company less appealing as he discovered the joy of spending evenings with Olivia and her friends, people who talked about books and ideas and passions instead of stock, prices and status symbols. I'm ready, he said firmly. But only if you are. We don't have to go. Olivia straightened his already perfect tie, a small gesture of intimacy that made his heart swell. We absolutely have to go. I have a new dress, you look handsome in that tux, and I want to see Derek's face when he realizes he's lost $5 million. Richard laughed, pulling her close for a kiss that she returned with enthusiasm. Have I told you lately that I adore you? You might have mentioned it, she teased, wiping a trace of her lipstick from his mouth. Now let's go show those boys what a real power couple looks like. The Oakhaven Country Club was as opulent as Richard remembered, though somehow it seemed less impressive now. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had once represented the pinnacle of success to him now felt cold and impersonal compared to the warm, lived-in comfort of the home he and Olivia had created together. Richard Sullivan, as I live and breathe, called a familiar voice as they handed their coats to the attendant. Thomas approached with his wife, Louise, who immediately embraced Olivia with genuine warmth. You look amazing, Louise gushed, stepping back to admire Olivia's dress. Is this from that designer you mentioned last month? As the women fell into easy conversation, Thomas pulled Richard aside. I wasn't sure you'd come tonight. Why wouldn't I? Richard asked, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Derek's been telling everyone the bet's nearly up. He's got big plans for his winnings. Richard smiled tightly. Is that so? For what it's worth, Thomas said, lowering his voice. I hope you win. Not for the money, I know you don't need it, but because I've never seen you this happy. Whatever started between you and Olivia, it's clearly become something real. Before Richard could respond, a commotion near the bar caught their attention. Derek, already red-faced and loud, was holding court with a group of younger executives. There he is, Derek called out too loudly. The man of the hour. 8 months married to big, beautiful Olivia. Just one more month to go, right, Richard? A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Richard felt Olivia stiffen beside him as she rejoined him, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. He squeezed back, a silent promise. Evening, Derek, Richard said coolly. I see you've started the festivities early. Derek stumbled slightly as he approached them, drink sloshing in his glass. Just celebrating. After all, we're in the home stretch of our little wager. He turned his bleary gaze to Olivia. Has he told you about our bet yet, sweetheart? About how much it was worth to him to pretend he could stomach being married to? That's enough. Richard cut him off, his voice sharp as steel. It's fine, Olivia said quietly. Yes, Derek, I know all about the bet. I've known from the beginning. Derek blinked in surprise, then let out a harsh laugh. Well, isn't that convenient? So you were in on it too? Getting a cut of the winnings? Actually, Richard said, stepping forward, there are no winnings. Not for me, anyway. A crowd had gathered now, watching the drama unfold with undisguised interest. Among them, Richard spotted Victor, the only one of his old friends who had declined to participate in the bet. What do you mean? No winnings? Derek demanded. The bet was $5 million if you stayed married for 8 months. It's been 8 months today. The money's going to the Parkview Medical Center's Cancer Research Foundation, Richard announced. I signed the transfer papers last month. Derek's face contorted with anger. That wasn't the deal. The deal, Richard said evenly, was a cruel, childish wager made by men who should have known better. I'm just making sure something good comes out of it. Victor stepped forward, clapping slowly. Well done, Richard. Better late than never. Derek wasn't finished. He turned to Olivia, swaying slightly. Don't tell me you've actually fallen for this act? You really think a man like Richard Sullivan would choose someone like you if there wasn't money involved? Look around. This isn't your world, honey. Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. the confident, radiant smile that had first caught Richard's attention a year ago. "You're right about one thing, Derek. This isn't my world. And thank goodness for that." She turned to address the onlookers. "My world has people who value kindness over status, who measure worth by character rather than bank accounts or body size." She reached for Richard's hand again. Fortunately, Richard's learning to prefer that world too. "Aren't you, dear?" Richard felt a surge of pride and love so strong it nearly took his breath away. "I am," he agreed. "Best education I've ever received," Derek scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You expect me to believe you've actually fallen in love with my wife," Richard finished for him. "Yes, I have, completely. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop insulting her in my presence. Or at all, actually." Derek looked from Richard to Olivia and back again, searching for the punchline to what he clearly thought was an elaborate joke. Finding none, his face darkened. "You know what? Keep the money. Give it to charity, burn it, whatever. But don't stand there pretending this is some great love story. We all know what this was." "What it was and what it became are two different things," Richard said quietly. "Something I hope you'll understand someday." He turned to Olivia. "Dance with me?" She nodded, and he led her to the dance floor, leaving Derek sputtering behind them. As the orchestra played a slow waltz, Richard held Olivia close, breathing in the scent of her perfume. "I'm sorry about Derek," he murmured. "Don't be," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Men like Derek are why I learned to value myself beyond other people's opinions. If anything, we should thank him." Richard laughed softly. "I wouldn't go that far." They danced in comfortable silence for a moment before Olivia spoke again. "My mother's latest scans came back yesterday. The doctors are using the word remission for the first time." Richard pulled back slightly to look at her. "Olivia, that's wonderful news. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wanted to wait for tonight," she explained, her eyes shining. "1 year ago, I overheard a cruel bet that I thought would be a business transaction and nothing more. Now my mother is getting better. My cookbook has a publisher, and somehow, against all odds, I've fallen in love with a man I never expected to like, let alone love." Richard's heart swelled at her words. "1 year ago, I made the most shameful decision of my life," he said softly. "And it led me to the best thing that's ever happened to me. Life has a strange way of working out, doesn't it?" As they swayed to the music, surrounded by the glittering elite of a world that suddenly seemed less important than the woman in his arms, Richard thought about how profoundly his life had changed. He had entered into marriage as a bet, expecting at best to endure it and at worst to fail. Instead, he had discovered what real success looked like. Not the accumulation of wealth or the admiration of peers, but the joy of being truly known and loved anyway. "Our agreement ends in 4 months," Olivia reminded him quietly. "The 1-year mark." Richard held her gaze steadily. "And then? And then we can decide what happens next. No contracts, no arrangements. Just us choosing each other. Or not." "I already know my choice," Richard said, pulling her closer. "I choose you, Olivia. For as long as you'll have me." Olivia smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting all the love he felt in his own heart. "Then I guess Derek was right about one thing," she whispered. "What's that?" "You did lose the bet." Her smile widened. "Because this stopped being pretend a long time ago." As Richard lowered his head to kiss her, right there in the middle of the Oak Haven Country Club dance floor, he silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led him to make that foolish wager a year ago. He had lost a bet, yes, but in losing he had gained something far more valuable, the chance to become the kind of man who deserved a woman like Olivia, not because of her size or in spite of it, but because of who she was and who they were together. And that, Richard realized, was the most astonishing outcome of all.